Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Barbara Natalizio. I am the current interim director and chair of the board of directors for the National Postdoctoral Association. I am your host for today's latest installment of APA's Staying on Track Pandemic Webinar Series. Today, we're talking about navigating pandemic-related visa and other challenges faced by international students and postdocs. Let me touch on some housekeeping items to start us off. So during the webinar, you can submit a question by using the questions box located in the webinar control panel. As time permits at the end, I'll also select some of those questions for our guests. If you experience any issues with audio or video, please make sure that you shut down other applications. If the problems persist, exit the webinar and rejoin using the invitation link you received. All right, let me start by introducing our guests today. Brendan Delaney is a partner at Frank and Delaney Immigration Law and a member of the Advisory Council of the National Postdoctoral Association. Representing foreign nationals working in the sciences, his work includes an emphasis on extraordinary ability and national interest waiver cases, as well as EB-1B, PERM, J waiver, and H-1B visa applications. Brendan works extensively with scientists, researchers, physicians, and other professionals, as well as organizations and employers in both academia and industry. He assists with their temporary and permanent visa applications on a company, individual, and institutional basis. Nusha Shishgar has worked in international student services since 2001 at public and private colleges and graduate institutions. She is currently the regulatory ombudsperson for student issues, Region 12, for NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, and senior coordinator of international student programs at Glendale Community College in California. She is an active member on the LA Peer and NAFSA International Student Advising Network email forums, providing responses and advice to international student advisors from around the nation. Brendan and Nusha, thank you for joining us today, and let's get started.
Great, thank you, Barbara. So as Barbara said, my name is Nusha Shishgar, and with me is Brendan Delaney. We're going to go over a quick agenda today. What we plan to do is to kind of move quickly through the information that you see here on the screen and really leave time to answer any questions that you have. But what we're going to talk today is review of the regulatory changes that have happened in response to COVID-19. Many of you are familiar with these, but I think it's helpful to start with a recap of what's already happened. We'll take a look at the executive orders and presidential proclamations that are in place and talk about some agency changes that have happened, both things that we know that have happened and things that are unknown, or the rumor mill. Then we'll get to some of your common questions and a few quick answers for them. So thank you to those who pre-submitted questions. And we'll end with some tips for students and scholars before we open up for questions and answers. So let's get started here. So first, let's talk about what's already happened. The Student and Exchange Visitor Program through the summer, in response to COVID-19, is allowing international students and scholars to study and work remotely. They are also allowing current international students and scholars to maintain status from within their home countries, which is not the usual case. Normally, to have immigration status, you do have to be physically located in the US. But as schools shut down, SEVP was very flexible with this in allowing individuals to return to their home country and still maintain status. They've also currently relaxed the regular OPT requirements. So generally when you're on OPT, you're expected to work 20 hours a week or more to maintain that OPT status. And in recognition of the challenges that students are facing now in finding jobs and in keeping jobs, SEVP has relaxed that and said that if you're working an hour or more, that you are still maintaining your OPT status while this pandemic exists. They've also confirmed the use of remote work. That's not too much of a change. OPT has always sort of generally allowed, or at least not disallowed, remote work. And so they've just confirmed that that is an opportunity to be explored. As far as the exchange visitor program, early on in the pandemic, around March, I want to say, there was a decision made to automatically extend the end date of certain DS 2019s for certain students and scholars. That was a one-time decision to allow individuals more time to depart the US if necessary, as flights and things like that started to get really impacted. USCIS really hasn't made too many changes. At this point, what they have done to make sure that individuals are able to continue with processing paperwork is that they've said that they will accept copies of original signatures. So this allows folks to work electronically through email with lawyers or with their schools, DSOs, and ROs to be able to file paperwork on their behalf. It's really important to note there that that is a copy of the original signature, not a digitally issued signature. So you can't type it. You do have to still sign, and then you can take a picture or scan, but that is a break from some of the applications which required hard copies. 3 agencies, the Department of State, Customs and Border Protection, and Student and Exchange Visitor Program, have agreed to allow the use of electronically issued and signed I-20s and DS 2019s for travel, for applying for a visa. It is still recommended that if you are using a electronically issued I-20 or DS 2019 for any of these purposes, that you carry a copy of the broadcast message from the Student and Exchange Visitor Program about the issuance of electronic I-20s and DS 2019s. If you don't already have a copy of that broadcast message, you can ask your DSO or RO or your employer to help you get that.
Okay. So I think Nusha's going to hand off to me now, and I'm going to sort of talk about some of the other sort of minor, I suppose, regulatory changes that have gone into effect here. And these are sort of some of the, I think, issues that we're sort of seeing people talk about or be at least aware of. The new H-1B process has gone into effect, tends to affect industry-based H-1Bs. In effect, it's a pre-registration, a new pre-registration. Over the past number of years, the H-1B process in industry, cap subject H-1Bs, have been under a lottery system. There have been many more H-1Bs filed than were able to be approved. So it's a lottery system, and we're now going to enter into a new pre-registration for H-1Bs in industry. The next point that's important to note is for I-9 flexibility. We're seeing some discretionary flexibility for what we term in-person document verification. So that's just important to note that we are seeing the agencies exhibit some flexibility and discretion in terms of how they are reviewing documents. There are caveats there that even though that may be waived in a certain way, that you still have to look at the documents in person on a timeline and extent that you can. So you just want to check the specific requirements in that respect. The next point I think we're going to move on to is some of the executive orders and presidential proclamations. So that's fun. A couple of things that I want to point out. Visa services and consulate closures. This is important to note for individuals. And just as a slight caveat here, a lot of people, I think, get a little confused about the difference between status in the United States and your visa. Okay, so, as Nusha mentioned earlier, the idea of maintenance of status, extension of stays, and things like that, which we'll also touch on, can be for students controlled by the I-20, DS 2019, etc. What we're talking about here is the issue of obtaining a visa stamp in your passport to come to the United States or to re-enter the United States. Due to consulate closures, what we've seen is overseas visa processing down by approximately 93% since January. So that's just a byproduct of the consulates and the embassies being closed and not issuing visas, along with everything else, which we will also mention. With that being said, however, the US State Department and the US government do recognize the importance of individuals who are working on and or with the COVID-19 situation. So there are still visas being issued on an emergent basis to individuals who would be considered to be medical professionals working to treat or mitigate the effects of COVID-19. So that's the current sort of state of play out there in the world of consulate and embassies in terms of issuance of visas. Now, with that all said, we are still in an era of travel restrictions, etc. And so therefore, to discuss some of that, I'm going to shift it back to Nusha.
Thanks, Garth. So yeah, this has been a fun time, we'll call, in international education, navigating all of these things that have come up. So as you all might be very well aware, most of the world right now is under some sort of travel restriction, either from the US or from those countries themselves. From the US side, there are travel restrictions in place currently for the People's Republic of China. That proclamation does exclude Hong Kong and Macau. There is one for Iran, all of Europe's Schengen area, as well as Ireland and the UK. And recently, most recently added was Brazil. And what these proclamations do is to limit travel from 14 days past the date of travel for anybody who wishes to come to the US. So basically what that is if you've been in any of these countries, any of these areas, for the 14 days immediately preceding your entry into the US, you're not allowed to come to the US. And that makes travel and transit very, very difficult, for obvious reasons. What that would mean is that in order to enter the US, you would have to go to a country that was not restricted by the US, stay there for 14 days past your date of travel, so in total 15 days, and then route to the US from one of those countries. Canada and Mexico also have a limited travel ban. What this does, a travel restriction, I should say, what this does is limit travel to essential services. As part of those essential services, work and school are included. So if you're from one of these areas and you're coming in on an I-20 or a DS-2019, for the most part, this will not really apply to you. And this is the only one that actually has an end date attached to it. All of the other proclamations at this point in time, we don't know when they're going to end. It's going to be at the behest or at the will of the current president of the US. The Canada-Mexico limit was recently extended to June 22nd. We will see if it gets extended again, but it is currently set to expire in a few weeks' time. The last and most recent proclamation, no, not the last, but the most recent proclamation was a very murky, sort of vague proclamation that got issued suspending entry of certain Chinese students and researchers at the graduate level or above, so graduate and postdoc, if those students and researchers receive funding or are employed by or connected to in any way, shape, or form the People's Republic of China's military civil fusion strategy. So basically, if the work that you were doing or the research that you're doing is tied back to the Chinese military. There are no real instructions for how to determine this, and this would be up to your consular officers to determine. So in terms of getting a DS-2019 or getting an I-20 for study, this won't affect that. So if you've been accepted to a school or are coming for research, you'll still be able to get the documents needed to apply for a visa, and it will be up to that consular officer to determine if you are from one of these areas that, or are from the Chinese area, that you would fall under this restriction. It's important to know that this does not apply to any undergrad studies. It is only at the graduate level and above. And for our last one, I'm going to pass it back to Brendan to talk about the limit on permanent residence.
Kept the best to last maybe on this one. So as everyone, most everyone, if not everyone, is aware that, well, it was back in April now, the time moves quickly, that there was a presidential proclamation issued about limiting permanent resident processing. Permanent residence is green cards, right? So the limit on issuance of green cards to foreign nationals coming to the United States. It got a lot of press, it got a lot of traction, but let me try and explain a little bit what it actually means. Because I think in the time period after the proclamation came out, after it was issued, we certainly fielded a lot of calls and took a lot of inquiries from concerned individuals as to how this would be affecting them. So without getting into the actual, into the weeds here as such, or into the nuts and bolts of it, I want to sort of be clear what it does in fact affect. And that's, it pertains to the immigrant visa processing at US embassies and consulates, okay? The Executive Office of the United States, the Office of the President, has traditionally been given sort of deference when it comes to entry to the United States of foreign nationals, of aliens. And so therefore, this administration is in effect utilizing Section 212F of the INA, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act, which pertains to the entry of aliens who are considered to be detrimental to the United States. That's the section of the Act that they have previously used for the travel ban. It's generally utilized in a national security situation. However, I think it's fair to say that for the first time, the current administration is utilizing this section of the Act to push back with respect to entry of aliens, utilizing a negative impact upon the labor market, as opposed to the idea, the traditional reasons for utilizing this, which would be national security or potentially public health, okay? So the green card, the issuance of green cards for certain categories, and there are caveats and there are waivers and things like that, but this pertains to issuance of green cards at embassies and consulates. So therefore, to the next point on the slide, it currently does not affect those individuals who are adjusting status in the United States, okay? So for example, if you are physically present here in the United States and you are processing a green card, and the final sort of step in that process is called the I-485, the adjustment of status, when you're adjusting your status from temporary resident to permanent resident, this does not currently affect that, okay? So you're not affected if you are here in the United States requesting an immigration benefit. However, based upon what we are sort of seeing and hearing on the grapevine, maybe is the appropriate term, is I think it's fair that this has the potential to be expanded to H-1Bs and other what we call non-immigrant visas, okay? So later on in our presentation here, we are going to talk about some of the sort of the tips, going to the proper source, etc. It's important for here to keep an eye on this. Right now, we're dealing with this issue affecting issuance of immigrant visas, green cards at embassies. I think it's fair to say that there is the potential for this to be expanded to other non-immigrant visas. That could be H's, L's, etc. And we're just going to have to wait to see how that plays out. But again, that's the current state of play with how the presidential executive orders and proclamations are affecting you guys. But the next step is, well, what has actually been going on with the agencies here in the United States? Okay, and just as a sort of quick, recap on that, one of the things to keep in mind, as an individual or to understand is that when you're physically located in the United States, you're in effect under the jurisdiction of USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. When you're outside the United States, you're in effect under the jurisdiction of the US State Department. That's who's dealing with issuance of visas at embassies, etc. So what's going on in terms of the agencies here in the United States, who you have to deal with and work with under this pandemic? Well, we have both the known and the unknown, and I get to do the known, and then I get to push it back to Nusha for the unknown, right? So first of all, a couple of things to sort of understand and be cognizant of. USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, have actually not closed completely during the pandemic, okay? I think there was a lot of reports, media, and maybe misunderstanding that they had shut down, okay? So as it notes there, the service centers, the administrative processing main centers have remained open and have allowed for ongoing filings, both for non-immigrant applications and for immigrant applications, green card applications, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? However, field offices, your local offices, had closed. Those were the places where you went for in-person appointments. So logically and logistically, it made total sense. There was no in-person appointments at field offices. They also stopped and postponed premium processing, whereby if you filed an application with a service center, you could pay them an extra fee to get a decision in 2 weeks. Premium processing is now being resumed and field offices are reopening. With that in mind, this administration a couple of years ago initiated a requirement that all employment-based green card applications would have a final interview. During this pandemic, we have seen certain employment-based green card applications having that final interview requirement waived, and therefore the agency has allowed and facilitated individuals to, in effect, receive final approval of their green card from the service centres. We're also seeing Social Security offices being closed for in-person services, which again is a logical and logistical byproduct of the situation we find ourselves in. So yes, immigration have maintained an opening for administrative processing of visas. They are reopening the field offices, and I think gradually we're going to start seeing administrative processing come back to normal. So that's how things have sat from a known standpoint in terms of agencies during this pandemic. And for the unknown, Nusha, take it away.
All right, so what don't we know? Currently, we don't know what Student and Exchange Visitor Program has planned for the fall. So I mentioned earlier that they're allowing up until summer, the end of our summer terms, they are allowing folks to register fully online and to take those classes from anywhere in the world. SCVP has not, at this point in time, confirmed that they will allow that plan to continue in the fall. So everyone is waiting on agency guidance for this. Really what this means for any students on the call right now is that if you are able to remain in the US over the summer period, I would personally highly recommend that. While I don't think that the Student Exchange Visitor Program will take away the ability to enroll fully online, because many schools are not prepared to reopen in the fall, while I think they will allow that to continue, they may require individuals to be back in the US during this time. Again, we don't know what's going to happen. That is speculation, and we can't really predict the future. So this remains to be seen, but it is something to think about, is that SCVP is not guaranteed that this deal will continue for the fall term. There's also lots of rumors going on right now with OPT. Will OPT be revoked? Will OPT be restricted in some way? What is the agency planning? At this point in time, the only thing that has happened is that 4 senators who are on the, in my personal opinion, the wrong side of immigration law, have written the government, written a letter to the president asking for restrictions to OPT on the basis of what Brendan was talking about earlier, impact on the labor market. There was recently a second letter saying the exact opposite and urging the Trump to keep OPT, signed by about 20 or so congressmen. So at this point, nothing has happened. Okay, OPT continues like normal, but it is being talked about that there possibly will be some changes. I know that brings a lot of folks anxiety, but what I want you to know here is that OPT is actually codified in federal regulation. And in order for federal regulation to be changed, there has to be a process of comment period. There has to be, Congress has to approve it. And getting Congress to approve anything, agreeing on anything, is a challenge these days. And there is actually quite a lot of support for the OPT program within Congress. Whether or not a president could invoke issues of national security as it relates to OPT remains to be seen. But you all, any student on the call should understand, any F1 student specifically, that there are lots of people in your corner. The American Institute of Law, I forget their AILA, I forget what the A stands for at the end, but they regularly file lawsuits against any kind of injunction or immigration process that appears to go against regulation unfoundedly. And so if the OPT was to be restricted, I would assume that there would be a swift action from the field and an injunction. That is all conjecture again, but I don't want you guys to worry too much about this. The OPT has been talked about for years and years and years and years about changing it, and the precedent has always been that it has stood exactly as is. So stay tuned on that.
Sorry, could I just chime in on that point? And just quickly, as we sort of mentioned in the presidential proclamation and executive order section, and as Nusha rightly pointed out there, that OPT is codified within the United States internally, and traditionally and historically, deference with respect to presidential power has been with respect to entry of aliens to the United States, which is not the case here. So Nusha, totally right that it's going to be interesting to see what happens, and I feel that yes, there will be people in your corner, as Nusha rightly points out, if they try and revoke this. Again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, however, and stay tuned, I suppose, as Nusha said.
Yeah.
So thanks for allowing me to just jump in there.
Of course. You're my partner, Brendan. Let's get to the last unknown here. We mentioned earlier that SVP, Department of State, and Customs and Border Protection all are on board with the electronic I-20. What we don't know is other agencies. So it's very possible that the DMV, Social Security Administration, any other federal governmental agency will not accept electronically issued documents. So keep that in mind when you go through these processes. Try, but you may have to reach out to your schools and employers to ask for official documentation if necessary to appease these other agencies. All right. All right, so let's jump into some quick questions and answers here. Looks like we froze, so I'm going to say we're going to jump right into some common questions and their quick answers. These are some of our pre-submitted questions, and we're going to try to get through these relatively quickly to give you some time at the end to ask more questions. Common question that we get: I cannot apply for my visa because of consular closures, but I do have a valid tourist visa, or I qualify for the tourist visa waiver program. So is it a good idea if I come to the US on that tourist visa, knowing that I can file a change of status, right? Really, no, this is not a good idea. This can actually be considered visa fraud because your intent, your actual intent, is to come to the US for a different purpose other than tourism. When you file for a change of status from tourist to anything else, the change of status from tourist to anything else is looked upon much more heavily than any other change of status application filed within the US. I say that broadly, but that is the experience because USCIS understands that a lot of individuals will use the tourist visa process to circumvent or to go around the consular processing. So they look at these very strictly. And if there's evidence that you came to the US specifically to go around filing for a visa, you will be denied that change of status. So it's not a good idea. If your intent is to come for study, if your intent is to come for work, it's best to just wait and obtain that visa at the proper time. So if you could, go ahead.
Sorry, if we could, I'm just going to make maybe one other quick point on that, is that if, for example, there was anyone here that had, let's say, for example, come on a tourist visa in January for 6 months, and that given the situation or the circumstances, then a discussion would be appropriate given the changed circumstances, because Nusha, this is one of the issues that it drives me, people, how do you quantify intent, right? It's so important to understand what Nusha just communicated to you guys, that the issue of visa fraud or misrepresentation is viewed so strictly by USCIS that it's vitally important that you don't get yourself into a situation where it can be construed that you committed visa fraud or misrepresentation. It can really create additional problems and roadblocks in the future. With that being said, I think given the circumstances, that if, for example, you came here legitimately as a tourist on a 6-month B2 back in January or February, and given the change of circumstances that happened in March, it may be possible that the circumstances could reflect an appropriate change of status. But again, that's a discussion to be had with the sponsor. And I'm in complete agreement, Nusha, that you just can't make that jump, and especially I think that this administration are holding people to a higher degree of scrutiny, and you got to be very careful making those requests.
Right. So, I mean, and to go to that point, Brendan, timing is really critical. So if you were to say, well, I can't get my visa for my F1 student visa because consulates are closed, so I'm going to come to the US first on the tourist visa, and then I'm going to apply for a change of status. A common thing that will be asked is, when were you accepted to your institution? So timing matters. If you were accepted to your institution prior to coming to the US on a tourist visa, then that establishes intent. So USCIS looks at the timeline of activity very, very carefully when determining those things. But like Brendan said, there's legitimate times where if you came to the US and then fell in love with the US and wanted to stay and decided to go get your education, that's a common path. Or you came to the US and during that time got a job offer, then possibly those change of statuses are appropriate. Or because of COVID-19, you can't leave,
Right.
that might be an issue to explore. But in general, we do not recommend that path of, well, I can't get A, so I'm just going to use B. We really don't recommend that.
And the other
So what
thing,
happens? Oh, sorry, Ben.
just one other point, because it is, I think, it's a big issue for people, is that one other point is that at the end of the day, anytime you sort of present yourself to request a visa or to be issued a visa, your entire US immigration history and visa history is in play. And just understand that anytime you request a benefit here in the United States, as Nusha pointed out, whether that's sort of change of status or whatever, all of your historical visa and US immigration background is up for review and can be, can certainly play into an officer's decision.
Right. So what happens if you can't get your visa, right? Consulars are closed, can't even apply, or we get it too late. What should you do? Just contact your sponsor or school to discuss a deferral of your program date. I know that that's not ideal. I know that, if you're overseas, you want to come, you want to get started, but that may not be an option, specifically just due to what's going on with COVID-19. If you're a student, you can actually begin. So you can take classes from overseas, begin taking classes towards your degree online so you don't lose that time. I understand it's a different experience and not what you signed up for, but it is an option. So discuss these things with your sponsors or your schools. So Brendan, is this me? This might be me. Has OPT processing been affected by COVID-19? Then I'll pass it to you for H1. But in general, no, right? As Brendan mentioned earlier, all service centers have been open and they've been processing. What really matters with finding a job in general, right, with OPT, is being prepared for the job market. So obviously right now, the job market is impacted by COVID-19 and just economies around the world have been devastated by this. Employers are starting to rehire, which is a good thing. But the best advice I can give to students on the line who are like, how can I get a job right now, is to make sure you're prepared to be a good job candidate. So that means not worrying so much about OPT getting approved, but making sure that you are prepared for an interview. So work with your career services offices, practice interviewing. So a lot of career service offices will offer mock interviews. I cannot stress to you the importance of that. They will look at your resumes, they will look at your cover letters. The process for applying for a job in the US is vastly different and looks very different from how we get those in our home countries. So it's really important to prepare for that process to make sure that when the time comes for an interview, you can ace it. The biggest difference that I see in students who go on OPT and find jobs and those who don't are the ones who've used their career services offices. And I'm talking a lot, not one appointment, a few times until you get it going. Another thing here, the common question that we get is, I'm on OPT right now, I want to apply for the STEM extension, but the CIP code, the Classification of Instructional Program code that's listed on my I-20, isn't on the STEM list. So can I apply for that OPT extension? No, unfortunately you cannot. It's also really important to understand here that your DSO cannot just change the CIP code on your program to make you eligible. The CIP code on your I-20 by law has to match the designation that the registrar's office has made for your program with the Department of Education. So unless your school changes its curriculum and changes its CIP code, your DSO can't just change it just to make you eligible for STEM, okay? If anybody on the call is in that first stage of, if you haven't yet graduated, it's a good conversation to have with your DSOs to ensure that the program that you're in is eligible for STEM. And if not, perhaps there's another related major that you could change to. Okay, but just know, if you're not eligible, there's no magic wand anyone can wave to make you eligible. You simply aren't eligible. All right, common thing that's come up during COVID. I'm on OPT and I've been furloughed. Does that count as unemployment? And this really depends on the use of the word furlough. So furlough is used broadly in human resources to mean a wide range of things. It can mean I'm on unpaid leave, still employed, but they're paying me, or they're not paying me while I'm on leave, or it can mean laid off. And the difference there is the key. So unpaid leave doesn't accrue unemployment days. So if your employer says, we're going to ask you to not work for a month, but when we resume, you are still employed, that is unpaid leave, okay? If the employer says, we're not going to ask you to work for this month, and when we resume, we want you to reapply for your job, that is laid off, okay? It's important to gain clarification if you land in this particular position by what your employer means by furlough. Also keep in mind that for the duration of COVID-19, again, SCVP is considering at least 1 hour a week or more as employed. And it's a good tactic to remember about self-employment and volunteering during post-completion OPT. Volunteering, let me be clear about volunteering. Volunteering, there's no such thing as volunteering for a private company, okay? That's an unpaid internship. Volunteering means non-governmental organization, nonprofit organization, okay? So if a volunteer position is appropriate for your degree, by all means you can do it, but a company can't just decide to not pay you for a job that they would normally pay somebody else, okay? And call that volunteer. That's not volunteer. That's a violation of labor law. And even though the employer is violating that law, you can get in trouble. So make sure that you don't do that. If you have any questions about whether a job is really a volunteer position or not, talk with your DSOs about that, your school officials, prior to accepting the position. Okay, Brendan, go ahead and tell us a little bit about H-1B here.
Yeah, I'll just mention that quickly. And again, I think actually the theme here is check in with your sponsor, check in with your petitioner. There's an issue, the H-1B, the specialty occupation is that you're required to be engaged in employment as per the application that was filed to USCIS. If you're benched, which in effect is that there's no viable work there for you, that can be problematic. So I think that if, for example, again, there's been discretion and things like that within the COVID-19 period. But if there is just not work to be done, it may be that an amended H-1B would have to be filed for you. And I think just in general here, what I would want to stress is to maintain open and clear communication with either your DSO or your employer, international office, etc., to make sure that what is being done administratively is in fact correct. So we'll move on to the next point or the next slide. I think I'll take the next two. So what about if your status is expiring? So you're filing for a change of status and or your status is expiring. Well, what can you do or what should you do? So first of all, the key is that if you have filed what we would term a timely and appropriate request for a change of status, or for example, an extension of status, then in most cases, an applicant can remain in the United States pending the adjudication of that request, okay? However, if you're wishing to change to an F1 or a J1, there's got to be a maintenance of underlying status, and it's possible that you may need to file a bridge application. That's something that we couldn't get into the sort of weeds of or the nuts and bolts of right now. But again, if you are in a certain status in the United States, and if, for example, you're then wishing to change to F1, then there's a bridging situation because of the current regulations with USCIS. That's something that you would want to discuss with International Office, DSO, etc. One other thing, again, given the issue over COVID-19, the inability to depart the United States, airlines, etc., we'll touch on that in a moment. We're going to say that you got to be, if you're here on an ESTA or a visa waiver, you can ask for what's called satisfactory departure. We're going to move through the next couple of slides pretty quickly so we can get to the live Q&A. So the next one is, I'm just going to move through this real quick because this is just, again, common question. Well, what are your options after OPT? And well, it depends. But generally speaking, the common sort of path or the avenue that one takes professionally in academia would be, especially in the context of the postdoctoral experience, would be to use the J1 Research Scholar visa, okay? Another valid option is the H-1B, and keeping in mind that academia is exempt from the H-1B cap, therefore an academic institution can always file a H-1B for you. With that being said, you guys come and are at many different organizations, institutions, universities, etc. Policies and procedures are different, and therefore it's important to talk to the people who matter in terms of what title and or position they may file for you, okay? Because University A may differ from University B in what may be an appropriate H-1B position. So you gotta be careful, you gotta remember to talk to the international office and say, okay, is this an appropriate option for me at the institution or university that I am at? Not what my friend told me. Also, Be careful about utilizing OPT jumping to industry, as it can potentially limit next non-immigrant visa options. And I say that for two reasons. Generally speaking, in an industry environment, there is a lack of J1 research scholar availability. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's certainly way more limited than it is in a university or academic setting. And also, industry H1Bs are obviously subject to the cap. So if, for example, you've jumped and are utilizing your OPT or the STEM extension for an industry position and then are unable or are not selected for the H1B cap, your next options potentially start being limited. Next couple are, I'm going to throw it over to you, Nusha, just quickly about the airlines.
So we get a lot of questions about airlines aren't operating. I'm in my grace period. Does this mean I have extra time to stay in the US? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. You are still required to leave or take action within your grace period. There are no automatic extensions of the grace period granted at this time. So the key here is to attempt to leave the US. Remember, you don't have to go home necessarily. You just have to leave the US. So if you're able to route into a different country and then from there route home, that's an option. What we tell all students and scholars right now is to keep your embassy apprised of your efforts to leave and keep proof that you are trying to go. So this would be proof of canceled flights, proof of bookings, etc., and proof of any contact that you've made with your embassy. That will be very important to show that you intended to leave within your grace period. Another option to maintain status if possible is, of course, to transfer. So if you are an undergraduate student, you can transfer into a graduate program or certificate program, for example, or apply for OPT or academic training if possible for your situation. If possible, you can also extend status. I believe we touched on that earlier, or file a change of status to tourist, an unusual step, but because of COVID-19, these are options to look at. Brendan, I'm going to ask you to go through kind of quickly.
The next question is, well, what about the potential long term here? And I want to sort of marry this in terms of potential not great news, but potential good news. And one of the things I'm going to sort of preface this is by saying that as highly educated individuals who work in an area or fields or professional disciplines of considered importance to the United States, that you guys ultimately, in many cases, have options that other professionals here in the United States do not. So let's say, for example, and I think it would be remiss of us not to understand that this pandemic has negatively affected the labor market. I mean, that's the reality. We are going to see the ramifications of that for months, if not years to come. So let's say, for example, if you lost your job, if the funding and you had to depart for whatever reasons, what's the long-term goal? Can you return here? Well, yes, you will be able to return here with a temporary visa, but what about a permanent application? What about a green card? Well, an appropriate step for many postdocs would be a national interest waiver. Now, I'm just going to say quickly what it is. It's important to note that the adjudication of this type of case is based upon an applicant's credentials and attributes, as well as the extent of their overall sort of scholarly and/or scientific contributions to the field. However, it's important to note that you don't necessarily need a sponsor for this type of application. So in the scenario that you may need to depart the United States because of, the labor market situation, etc., and you had to return home, this is actually an application that you can file without regard to your geographic location. So therefore, if you're forced to depart the US, lack of funding, lost position, you could file an application from your home country, and if approved, you could ultimately return to the United States with a green card. Okay, this is a question that we've seen pre-submitted. One other note on this, and then I'll move on, is that there is a defined standard of adjudication. It's not set by this administration. It was actually set by a court case about 3.5 years ago called the matter of the Hanisar, and so therefore, ultimately, if you meet the standard, you can qualify. Okay. Look, it's a high standard and restrictive, but it's an option. And I'll pass it back to you, Nusha, for the advocacy.
Awesome. So we also had some really great questions come through about advocacy measures. So loved this. I work at an institution. What can I do to advocate for students and scholars? Or I'm a student or a scholar. What can I do to help others? Institutions, for any institutions on the line, your congressmen need to hear from you. even if your congressman supports international education, they need to hear that you still support international education, because the more that they hear that, the more they assume that's representative of the entire community. And they need the numbers to go into Congress and say, no, my constituents still want this. So it's really important to tell them how these changes impact your school, how they impact your community, how they impact your institution of employment. Ask congressmen outright to support pathways for education and employment of students and scholars. If you're connected on NAFSA, NAFSA has a draft letter that you can just quickly sign and send on in support of OPT, for example, in support of study abroad. So it's really important to take those advocacy measures and be really active. Tweet them on Twitter, whatever it is that you need to do. And it's what you can do to support your students during this time is to, even now more than ever, connect students to resources, possible job opportunities that are out there. Faculty especially can play a really valuable role in the job opportunity connection, because they sometimes hear of things from friends, right? Or know of positions that are opening in labs. Connect your students to those things and that's a huge, huge help. But that advocacy key is key. Students and scholars, what can you guys do? Number one, make your voices heard, okay? Provide data to your institutions. So if you are part of a club, say, I've got 30 students in the Chinese club who are being affected by this, and this is how it affects us, and this is how much money we bring to your institution. I hate to sound callous about it, but money speaks. So give that data to your institution so that they can take that up the chain and give that to congressmen to really show the impact of this. And this is key. We're going to get to it a little bit later from the folks from APA on the call, but seek help when needed. This is a strange, confusing, isolating time. In a lot of ways, it's also been very inspiring, and I hope that you take some solace in seeing how the community has really come together to fight COVID-19, really come together around issues of social justice. But when you're not feeling good, seek the help. There's nothing wrong with that. There are people trained to talk you through these difficult situations. And if you see a friend who's really struggling, reach out to that individual, help get them connected. That's more than ever. I think that's what you guys can do to help one another. So we're going to end real quickly on some fast tips for students and scholars. Number one thing, guys, just don't panic right now, all right? I know it's easy. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, a lot of rumors. Go to the proper source for advising. So this is your DSO, this is your RO. And be careful about what you see on the internet. Be careful about what you hear from your friends. At orientation, I always like to say your friends mean well, but your friends are always wrong. Okay, they just,
yeah.
What happens in one person's case doesn't necessarily apply to you. So always go to the proper source and review the laws and regulations with a professional. The professional for F1, J1, M1 matters is going to be your DSO or your RO. A professional for other matters, H1B, O, permanent residency, is going to be somebody like Brendan. But talk with these folks, talk with both, and explore all the options that are available to you. We talked about this earlier. Explore extensions if possible, or change of status if possible, okay? And on a note of reaching out to your embassies and consulates for advice into keeping them aware of what's going on with you if you are trying to leave, know that interagency communication and understanding about rules and regulations isn't always great, and it's not always consistent. So for example, I've had plenty of students who've reached out to their embassy, and their embassies tells them, well, if you're an F1 student, file an I-539 to extend your status. It doesn't work that way for F1s. F1s have to have a valid reason, OPT, transferring to another school, to maintain that F1. So just know that agencies try, but the best people to know the rules for your F1, J1, M1 are your DSO and RO, and the best folks to know information for other statuses are legal professionals, legal attorneys like Brendan. So Brendan, let's roll through these real quick.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'll just do the last point and then I'm going to hand it over to Garth. I mean, basically, I think just one thing is, if I had to sort of almost roll about the last 3 points, you could just bring them up, Nusha, is get prepared early. We're going to be looking at administrative processing delays. There's potential budgetary concerns, and just being careful about unauthorized activity in this. And that goes back to my point that I said, and Nusha has reiterated, communication with your DSOs, communication with employers, and therefore, and ultimately there are the legal and administrative remedies here for you to explore. So I thank you. It's been I'm going to hand it over to Garth now, I think, for some final live Q&A, right?
Sure, we're going to, I want to thank you, first of all, Brendan and Nusha, for giving a very thorough and in-depth presentation, a lot of information in there. A lot of people have asked, will the slides be available? They are currently available now in the handout section, so you can download those and you can distribute those to your postdocs if you're a faculty advisor or run an office. We have well over 700 people who have been submitting questions, and we're trying to send them into Brendan and Nusha via chat. But we do have to remind you that, please be careful. They can't really give what would be considered legal advice. So if your question starts with, I have this visa and I'm trying to do this, what's my outcome? That's not something that we're going to be able to ask them, because that verges on legal advice, and that's not something we're liable to, we're not allowed to give that over this forum. But we do have some questions that are kind of more general, like about waiting periods. One question, Nisha and Brendan, that has come in is talking about the status of familial relationships. Some of the examples might be, so what about my spouse? I'm here, I'm on a visa, I'm working, but my spouse was on a visitor and it's set to expire. Or what about children? And those types of things. What kind of answers do you have or advice can you give about these familial relationships and how they are being impacted and what options might be available to someone?
So I can take this one. I mean, in general, your dependents are tied to your status. So if you're able to extend your status, as long as they are independent of you. So for example, an F1 with an F2, an H1 with an H4. If you extend your status, those individuals' status also gets extended. If a dependent comes to you or came with you on a different status, so in the case where you came on an F1 and the person's on a tourist, then the previous discussion that we had about those changes would come into play. So the dependent can look at a change of status. They can look at an extension of status if their particular visa type allows that.
So there's been a couple questions that have come in through your chat. So if you guys want to look at those too, but I can continue reading one. One that I think that sounded good that Brendan, you kind of alluded to, but as your final piece of point, but some people have asked, is there a premium processing that is available in particular for things like OPT? And if possible, is it, what about requesting it after you may have already submitted? So maybe going back and adjusting the process based upon things that happens. What kind of those types of options are out there?
Well, the quick answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that USCIS have some policies or procedures in place where it may be possible to request expedited processing. But unfortunately, that's very discretionary. I don't know, Nusha, maybe you could chime in there.
Yeah, in general, and recently, actually, I should say, USCIS updated their rules for what qualifies for expedite to remove, I have a job that is starting. So you now basically have to have either your job has to have a direct fiscal impact and a huge fiscal impact on the operation of your institution, or be in the interest of the national government for you to have an expedite. Otherwise, folks, it's just a waiting game. This is why what Brendan said earlier applies. You need to apply early. So, as an international student advisor, I tell my students to apply for OPT 90 days before the start of their program. And some don't apply until the day they're graduating. That's a student decision. And unfortunately, that means you're going to run into a longer timeline and you're going to lose out on some processes, or on some benefits. So it's really important to follow the advice of your DSOs and ROs, to follow the advice of your employers when it comes to extensions of things like H-1B, and file early, as early as you possibly can. And then it's just.
I think, Garth, there was a question come in on the chat about employment authorization for those who are adjusting status to permanent resident, because that question is somewhat analogous to OPT in terms of employment authorization. Employment authorization cards issued while waiting for adjustment of status. There's just two quick points I'd like to make. If it's an initial filing, then under adjustment of status for employment-based and family-based, the code is C09. So the card will be issued. Now, there may be a period of time that if, for example, you are transitioning from one status to another, that you may run out of employment authorization depending upon when you filed and the processing times, number one. Second, and I think that the question inferred at least an extension. So if, for example, your adjustment is pending and you file an extension of your employment authorization, there is an automatic 6-month extension from the date of expiration of your current card. So you do have that sort of latitude and leeway. But again, we don't know what the administrative processing is going to look like in the future. I think that generally speaking, what I tend to advise people is that if things are getting closer to the wire and you're utilizing part of that extension, and especially for people involved in the medical field, etc., there is the possibility of doing a congressional inquiry or something like that to try and reach out to immigration to say, listen, my extension has now been pending on a C09 EAD for an extended period of time. Can you check in on this? It's just one option.
And we're talking very extended periods of time. We're talking 6 months, 9 months, when not within their processing periods. And that's something
Correct.
that you folks need to keep in mind. USCIS publishes their processing periods. And until you are outside of that processing period, you cannot start an inquiry to speed it up. Okay. We had some good questions. Sorry, Brendan.
No, again, it just all goes back to start early.
Yeah, start early.
You know?
So a couple questions that came in over chat. Is it legal to stay in the US in the fall if the classes are fully online? So again, right now, we don't know because the Student and Exchange Visitor Program has not told us if they will allow that for the fall. So keep an eye out for information from your schools about that. As soon as we know, trust me, they will let you know. And another great, kind of unrelated to what we've been talking about today, but a great question. Any insights about the stimulus check? I received one and not sure if I should return it. I am an international student. So what will I tell you real quickly, I'm not a tax expert. However, what we have been told in the field is that in general, non-immigrants, so anyone here on a student visa or non-immigrant visa is not eligible for that stimulus check. If you received one, it's probably because you filed somewhere down the road your taxes incorrectly as a resident. You do need to amend that tax filing, so talk to a tax expert, and you do need to return that check. Talk with your DSOs about this. There has been information on NAFSA. If your DSOs don't know where to look, they can find information on NAFSA about the stimulus check, but in general, you are not eligible. You should return it because keeping it could lead to issues down the road.
All righty. I want to ask 2 questions that I have seen coming in, and then maybe we'll have to, it's 1 o'clock, and so thank you guys for your time and move on to closing. One is kind of related to the question you asked before about being fully online, and it's more about specifically in a lot of clinical health fields like psychology, individuals have to do pre-internships before they graduate, and then a lot of them also have to do postdoctoral, so post their degree, but they're kind of like a residency of some sort. And they're, what are some of the questions about the statuses of those? Like, you're currently maybe visiting, you're out of state. Will you be able to come back in to do your internship? Or what about the status of coming in to do a postdoc that you've been accepted for, but right now travel, you don't have all your paperwork? Some of the advice on these types of more clinical residency type related issues.
So there's a couple things in that. So let me try to break it down.
Yeah, that was a lot. You had to unpack it. I apologize.
No, don't apologize. There's just a lot of pieces that are moving parts. So if you are overseas and you are coming for a program, that program must be taught physically. Okay, so you must have a physical presence. Otherwise, so that would be working directly in your lab, taking courses, doing your practicums. Okay, if those things are not done physically for the fall term, you cannot come to the US at this time. You have to defer your attendance. Okay, that's what the government has told us. So that's not something your schools have any leeway on. Now, if your school or institution, host institution, is providing those opportunities to you physically in person, then you can come into the US. Now, finding jobs, right? So if you're currently a student and you have to do some pre-internship or a post-internship, the post-internship would be that OPT style, right? After we graduate, we have to apply for OPT. Depending on how your program lays it out, most of you are going to be using OPT for that. Some of you may use CPT, some of you may use academic training. Again, this goes back to being ready for a job. So job market right now, a little tight. Jobs are just not as available. You have to shine, and knowing how to shine is key. So utilize the resources from your career services office. I, again, cannot stress how important it is to be prepared for the job application process. If you are prepared for the job application process, whether that's for an internship, whether it's for a postdoc, anything, that preparation is key. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I was just
No.
going to piggyback on a slightly separate point that Nusha touched on there, which I think is, and I understand that APA and MPA have done a number of different webinars and a series of webinars that touch on different facets of someone's professional sort of development, maybe for want of a better term, I'm using that term loosely. And I think that as someone navigates, as an international student or scholar navigates the journey with respect to visas, all of these different attributes that you guys maybe bring them professionally, APA, MPA, as Nusha touches on career development, it all ultimately comes together, because I think it allows people to make informed decisions about what their next steps are with respect to their visa, and it can ultimately enhance their overall potential visa application or the journey that they will take. So I always encourage people to not just sort of turn up for the visa and immigration one, because obviously it's front and center, but to utilize the different resources that, you know, APA, MPA are providing them in different facets of their career.
Yeah, no, I wanted to thank you that. We'll get a moment to talk about some of the other resources that people can get as we're closing up. I also wanted to point out, I know, a part of our population, especially the clinical psychology program, please don't be afraid to talk to APIC. That's a great resource you have on your internships and your postdoctoral services. And of course, reaching out as much as possible that we can give broad advice within the grad ed office. So you can follow up with our email on those as we try and work through all these different scenarios. So I am gonna have to wrap this up and answer a lot of great questions for people. So there are lots of resources that are available for you that you can visit online. And make sure you wanna move to our next slide. The National Postdoc Association has what they call their International Central Hub. It's kind of your one-stop shop for a lot of resources that touch a lot of these topics, but also just generally being an international postdoc or a graduate student within the US. It's a great site, and right there's the link, and that's brought to you by the National Postdoctoral Association, so please be sure to visit that. The APA has a COVID-19 response page that addresses many questions and issues on that. For the next slide, please. You can find the link on our APA website. And if you look at the top, a lot of it says there's these COVID-19 information and resources. It's broken up into sections about telehealth for psychology people, in particular, healthcare work, an entire section on education, training, and distance learning, things about grant funding, continuing research, learning to shift to online courses, both as a student, but also maybe as a TA or an early career person in academia, about teaching those. So I really do encourage you to check out that website. There's the link for that. And a lot of questions about the slides and the content. So the slides are currently available for you right now in the handout section. So you can download the slides that were here today and take them out, including all the detailed questions and answers that Nusha and Brendan prepared from the pre-submitted questions. But the video will also be available on this Staying on Track website. And this is part of our series that the APA has developed. Brendan had mentioned before, we did things from managing your research, preparing people to do defenses of their thesis or their master's, your qualifying exams remotely and from home, job searching during this process, you know, all kinds of issues, including a number of resources that Nusha mentioned before about self-care and resiliency, and making use of your community. So I really do encourage you to visit the Staying on Track page and visit regularly, because we'll be updating, and once we get the recordings and the slides and everything formatted, we'll be able to have that stuff up from here. So I want to thank Nusha and Brendan for dedicating their time today and being part of this. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the invite to do it. It's been a pleasure.
No problem. And I also want to know that once this is done, there will be a short survey that comes out when we close this. Really would appreciate you filling that out for us. And within a day or so, you'll get follow-up emails with all the content and reminders about coming back to the Staying on Track and things like that. So I want to thank everyone who's been involved today. I want to thank the National Postdoctoral Association and Barbara for co-hosting this and helping bring this together. This was a first project of collaboration between the two, and it was very exciting for our two organizations to do that. And I have a number of staff that were working diligently in the background, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank them for all their effort, even if they weren't here. But a lot of people went into pulling this off today. So with that, thank you very much, and everyone have a nice day.